Now we are going to go over to our second speaker for this afternoon. Is Dr. Christian Reynolds. Welcome, Christian. Christian is the Senior Lecturer at the Centre for Food Policy at City University of London. So welcome, Christian, and over to you.
Hello, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. It's an absolute privilege to be here talking to you all on International World Gastronomy Day. It's brilliant. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about healthy and sustainable diets, as you've heard from many in the first panel, but I'm also going to be thinking about where the gastronomy is in that. Where's the food culture in discussing these healthy, sustainable diets? And then I'll also be weaving in a little bit about the food loss and waste that what Leon was just talking about there into this as well, and bringing a bit of context there. So as I said, hello, my name is Christian Reynolds. I'm the Senior Lecturer at the Centre for Food Policy. I'm originally from Australia, hence this very weird accent I have, but I've worked in the UK on healthy, sustainable diets, food consumption, and also food loss and waste for about the last decade. And I've worked in food politics, food history, and also gastronomy and social sciences approaches, because we have to take this as a very food systems perspective in relation to all of this. So today's talk, I want to first outline some of these big challenges that you've already heard about, but just doing a little bit of a reminder and putting those into a bigger long-term context. And then I was then going to talk about why we need those sustainable diets and highlight why demographic change and also these changes since COVID-19 has affected are actually helping us, and then think about how we go from here towards moving towards healthy, sustainable diets while thinking about gastronomy. So the big news is that the climate is changing. So as you can see on these graphics on the left here, the climate has been increasing. And if we're thinking of different amounts of climate change over time, a 0 to a 0.5 degree change in some short-term perspectives could lead towards positive increases in yield. However, over longer time periods and also over longer temperature extremes, that can equal falling crop yields, changes in water use, changes in energy use. And here's an image from The Guardian on the left of the screen from earlier this month when the kind of cold snap hit. It's hard to believe now in terms of there was a heat wave, but there was a frost right at the beginning, and French winemakers were estimating it was one of the worst frosts in a decade, which led to damage. And that was from changes in climate variability. Of course, the climate is changing and food production and climate change are linked. So this is a slide here showing the circles are the different grain bowls or the major places of food production in the world. And you can see on this map a forecast of what's going to happen with different levels of climate change in terms of, as we go towards that 2030 to 2050 mark, what's going to happen to yields and harvests. And you can see there are impacts, some positive, some negative, depending where you are on the planet. So food production and climate change are linked, and it differs depending where we are. But of course, food and climate have always been linked. And this is one of the big things that's kind of been blowing my mind for the last 2 or 3 years, is thinking about food and climate systems, not just now, but going back over the long view. So on screen, this top image here is the global temperature readings over the past 2,000 years. So since a lot of civilization and technological advancements have been happening. And there's a point on that graph between about 1300 and 1700, which can be called the age of extremes, or within that, there's also a thing called the Little Ice Age, which is from about 1400 to 1600s, but a massive climate variability. And you can see there are partial cooling, which means there were temperature drops of 0.5 or less over that time. And that resulted in food system changes. So the two images at the bottom of this screen are showing the spikes in both wheat and rye in different parts of Europe according to when there were frosts, when there were famine, based on this cooling. So food and climate and the food scarcities and challenges because of climate change have always been linked. However, because of this feedback loop, this Little Ice Age or this age of extremes, most of those were within this 0.5 degrees forecast. We're now forecast to move a lot faster and a lot harder into a global warming scenario rather than this global cooling scenario. So food production and consumption impact upon climate because of the way that the food is produced. Climate then impacts upon food production and consumption because of the impacts in terms of yield, stresses, climate variability, etc. And to make resilient societies, or how societies have adapted, we've had to change how we farm, how we cook, what we cook. So the central gastronomy of what we're eating today has been informed by these climate changes in the past. Where there's dairy, where there's rye, where there's wheat, where certain fruits and crops are grown, has been directly influenced in part by soil as well as climate. And this has mainly been done over the last 2,000 years for these global cooling events in terms of cool food systems, crops, modes of production. So these have been foundational as we moved into this international era of commodification and also just modern food systems. It's been a cool food system that we've been actually becoming resilient against over the last 2,000 years, except we're going into a now a heating world. So we need to think about how we adapt our diets to meet this. So the big challenge for this is that we have a warming food system and we need to cut our emissions to meet that, as was said in the previous panel. And there were lots of different highlights of different things from farming through to the nutritional argument there. So you can see on the graph here, the grey is where we kind of were at. The yellow is where if we continue with growth in terms of greenhouse gas emissions to get to, that second bar there. But where we actually need to get to stay within those warming targets is way over on the right, this small little box of yellow there. So that's the level we need to get to in terms of emissions from the food system. And you can see right at the center of that graphic there is a red box, that little reduction box. And that's the greenhouse gas emissions that are estimated by WRI, the World Resources Institute, that can be created through shifting our diet. So the biggest thing from the dietary and demand standpoint is changing what we eat, changing how we cook, will lead towards a more healthy, sustainable dietary practices and lead towards lower greenhouse gas emissions to be living within our boundaries. So, to think about what those sustainable diets actually are. So in 2019, the Eat Lancet report came out, and it was setting this scientific target, which was based on nutrition, based on environmental impacts, and the Malthusian dilemma. How do we feed the entire planet, the 10 billion, within planetary boundaries? And the two big takeaways from me for this, if I'm summarizing it down for this 15-minute discussion, are saying that we need to increase our consumptions of fruit and vegetables. So we need to massively uplift. If you see that image on the right-hand side of the screen, it's increasing fruits and vegetables to be half of the plate if we're thinking about it like that. And that ties directly into what Leon was saying in terms of the challenges around food loss and food waste, because food waste and food loss happen with fruits and vegetables as well as everything else. But the other big part of this is to reduce the consumption of animal products quite drastically. So it can still happen within diets in culturally sensitive amounts, but we need to be dramatically reducing it. In the UK, for instance, the typical portion size of a piece of red or processed meat is about 125 grams per portion. The National Health Service is recommending we cut down to 70 grams per portion for health reasons. So even if not for sustainability, we need to be cutting for health as well. So we need to be reducing animal proteins and animal products and increasing the fruits and vegetables. However, the Eat Lancet had a few criticisms of it. And one of the big criticisms was around the gastronomy. They did this report as a technocratic solution to solve the Malthusian dilemma. Can we feed everybody within planetary boundaries? The answer is yes, but within that report, they had a lack of consideration for these local food systems, for the traditional diets that have come out of these 2,000 years of farming responding to different practices. Different ways and systems of food production are within our globe, yet there was no consideration of that. Likewise, there was limited suggestions on how to actually implement within different sustainable diets in terms of what global healthy sustainable diets actually look like. They had some photos such as these ones here. And then lastly, there was minimal discussion of cooking and how everything actually fits together, in what proportions. And so there's been some great work recently within the last year by the Barilla Center, proposing for different gastronomies, different diets to link to that. Because to me, and I think to many people, the gastronomy, the food culture needs to be there to link to sustainable diets, to make sure it's a culturally appropriate, sustainable diet that we're eating. And the thing that I really care about and find amazingly interesting is that how we actually cook matters a great deal. So if we think back even to, say, the 1970s, Hannah More Lappy published a book called Diet for a Small Planet, which was one of the seminal foundational texts in terms of actually discussing what we need to eat and what we eat's environmental impacts back in the 1970s. More recently, say, Anna Jones has published books such as One Pot, One Pan, One Planet, which is a really interesting modern sustainable cookbook, shall we say. But in December of last year, we published a paper looking at the environmental impact of how we cook versus the rest of the supply chain. And so the numbers on screen here are for the UK cookery habits, but we have multiple other countries there as well. And it's highlighted that for certain food products, the cookery impact could be up to 60% of the overall impact. So for instance, a potato or cabbage or those sorts of things, if you're cooking them in specific ways, which are the typical ways that happen in the UK, they have up to 60% of the impact is related to the cooking. Likewise, however, the cooking of animal-based products, even though it's a much smaller percentage, if you're looking at these graphs, you can see the axes on the horizontal axis, vertical axis are different. You can see that in the animal protein section, you can see the beef and lamb impacts there are actually, they're only 7 or 9%, I believe. But equally, those in terms of scale are bigger than the impacts of the potato cooking, for instance. And that's because we're roasting, we're doing inefficient methods of even cooking our animal products. So regardless of if it's sustainable plant-based cuisine or if it's sustainable animal-based cuisines, we need to be thinking of how we cook. And so if I can, in my last 3 minutes or so, I'm just going to show you some thoughts on where we could go. So there are a couple of things we could be doing here to disrupt our eating, disrupt our cooking for lower carbon emissions and better gastronomy. And we could be moving our entire gastronomic cuisine, how we cook, how we teach cooking, towards other things. We could be reducing consumption instances. We could be moving towards smaller portion sizes. So we could be going towards that 70 to 90 grams, or we could be, instead of going to one single piece of meat, we could be cutting that meat finely, stir frying it, mixing it with lots of vegetables, or we could be blending that meat with other things. So the last of those scenarios, of course, would be either a blended burger, so meat plus other items, or going to an entirely a plant-based burger, meat simulacra. And by this, I'm highlighting that there are multiple different scenarios towards a sustainable diet, because currently we have lots of different cooking habits, lots of different dietary patterns. So this picture on screen shows that there are people already in the UK with low greenhouse gas but unhealthy diets. They need different messaging and different methods of changing their diets, changing their cooking practices, compared to the people who have high greenhouse gas and healthy diets. So there's different strategies we need. And the good news on this is that dietary change has happened over history. If we look at this in terms of a demographic thing, as different groups over time of age, so this is some surveys dating back to the 1940s until today, we've compiled them to see how people from different generations' greenhouse gases shift over time. And the headline of this is, the people born today eat more sustainably, eat with different sorts of foods than they did 100 years ago, or 50 years ago, or even 20 years ago. So the generation of 20-year-olds today have a different dietary pattern and different environmental impacts to baby boomers when they were 20 in the 70s, for instance. The catch is, of course, that we have more ultra-processed food. Another way to think about this is also not just the dietary pattern, but the acceptability of change. So this is a slide where we were looking at food in terms of flexitarianism. So there's the YouGov data there in this lighter shade versus a survey from the University of Sheffield. And you can see here that within the younger generations, University of Sheffield students, that there were more people who are flexitarian and less meat eater only type people. And so we actually started to change the offerings on campus at the University of Sheffield to be more flexitarian to help speed that along. So that's a way to actually start moving towards sustainable gastronomies and sustainable diets. Likewise, we could also be changing perceptions and practices around different issues. So there are different drivers. So it could be for religious reasons, it could be for health, it could be for economics, it could be for animal welfare. There are different drivers for different people at different stages of life and in different geographies. So here's some work from a paper we're just working on here. It's a spoiler, so I can send you more references if you're interested, but this is in terms of healthy, sustainable diets. So that's some of the things that we can do to reduce meat intake or move towards sustainable diets. And COVID-19 is a brilliant moment of change for that, because we can see that since lockdown, since all these different lockdowns and changes for each person, different things have been happening in life, including changing shopping habits and changing cooking habits. And studies have come out even regarding food loss and waste. For instance, on this graphic here, you can see that at lockdown, there was a dramatic drop in the amount of food loss and waste produced in British households, but then that stabilized. And so we're moving to a new normal now, post-COVID. What we need to now think about is, where do we go next? We need to think about that we've come to a new part in regards to food loss and waste. We've come to a new part in regards to healthy, sustainable diets because of the COVID momentum. Where do we go now in this new normal? And the take-home messages I need to say to you are that consumption and production within a sustainable diets framework can both address. But in regards to this, we've got to think in a long-term perspective. So that means we need to think about dietary change, how it's shifted over time. And that means that we can also address different things towards sustainable diets in regards to increasing the fruit and vegetables and decreasing meat. And further dietary change is happening and is possible, as evidenced by generational change and also by this change within COVID-19. And we can continue to use this return to a new normal as part of that change. So finally, I'm just going to highlight that there's a survey out at the moment on food security for university students within the UK. So I'm going to put into the chat, facing you guys in a few seconds, a web link to this survey. Anybody who's a university student, or if you know a university student who's studying in the UK currently, please do fill that in. It's really helpful in terms of understanding how students have had experiences over these last 12 months or since COVID began. It would be brilliant if you could fill that out or retweet the link in the chat that's coming up now. But thank you very much for letting me talk to you today. Bye.